There are names in history that echo for centuries, names that carry within them not merely a life, but a transformation, a before and an after that divides everything the human mind believed it knew. Albert Einstein is one of those names. He was born on March 14, 1879, in the small German city of Ulm, a city that sits quietly along the banks of the Danube, surrounded by the gentle hills of Swabia. The streets were narrow, the winters cold, and the air carried the smell of coal and fresh bread. His parents, Hermann and Pauline Einstein, were a secular Jewish couple of modest means. His father ran an electrochemical business with his brother, and his mother was a musician, a woman whose love for Mozart and Beethoven would imprint itself permanently on her son's soul. But from his very first days, Albert Einstein seemed to operate on a different frequency from the rest of the world. He was slow to speak, so slow that his parents grew genuinely alarmed. They consulted doctors, neighbors whispered. When he finally began to form words, he had the peculiar habit of repeating sentences softly to himself, as if testing whether language was a reliable enough instrument to carry his thoughts. His schoolmates in Munich gave him a nickname, Der Dipperte, the dopey one. What they did not know, what no one could have known, was that inside that quiet, seemingly unremarkable boy, the universe was already beginning to answer questions that had not yet been asked. This is the story of Albert Einstein, a story of rejection and perseverance, of love and betrayal, of discoveries that rewrote the laws of nature, and of the terrible weight that comes with a mind powerful enough to reshape the world. A story that does not end with his death, because even after his final breath in a Princeton hospital room in April of 1955, the story of Einstein continued in ways that are as astonishing as they are deeply human.
Munich in the 1880s was a city in full transformation. Gas lamps were giving way to electric lights. The air smelled of modernity and ambition. Hermann Einstein and his brother Jacob had founded a company to ride that wave, selling electrical equipment in a city that was rapidly electrifying itself. They even illuminated the famous Oktoberfest celebrations in 1885, flooding the festival grounds with electric light for the first time. It was in this setting that young Albert grew up, and yet his inner world bore little resemblance to the bustling commercial city around him. He was a solitary child, deeply uncomfortable with the rigid Prussian discipline of Munich's schools, where obedience was prized above curiosity and rote memorization was considered the highest form of learning. He hated it, not because he was lazy, far from it. He hated it because it made no sense to him. Why memorize what you could reason? Why repeat what you could discover? At the age of 5, his father gave him a compass. It was a small thing, a simple instrument, but for Albert Einstein, it was a thunderbolt. The needle always pointed north, no matter which way he turned, no matter what he did. Something invisible, some force he could not see or touch, was reaching through space and commanding that needle. He later wrote that this experience shook him to his core, that he felt for the first time that something deeply hidden lay behind the visible world. 2 years later, his mother placed a violin in his hands. He resisted at first. Then he heard Mozart, and his world changed. Music became for Einstein what equations would later become, a language more perfect than words, a structure of pure logic wrapped in beauty. Throughout his life, whenever he was stuck on a particularly difficult problem, he would reach for his violin. Friends recalled hearing him play in the middle of the night and then suddenly stop, declare with sudden clarity, "I have it," and rush back to his desk. But the world was not kind to the young Einstein. The family business failed, and in 1894, his parents packed up and moved to northern Italy, first Milan, then Pavia. Albert, now 15, was left behind in Munich to finish his schooling.
Alone in a boarding house, surrounded by a culture he found suffocating, facing the looming prospect of mandatory military service in a German army he had no desire to join, he made a radical decision. He walked away. He forged a doctor's note claiming nervous exhaustion, convinced the school authorities to release him, and showed up unannounced on his parents' doorstep in Pavia. His parents were dismayed. Their son was now a school dropout, a potential draft dodger, with no degree, no plan, and no prospects. He also quietly and formally renounced his German citizenship. At 15 years old, Albert Einstein was officially stateless. He spent a brief happy time in Italy, later describing those months as among the most beautiful of his life. He hiked through the hills of northern Italy, visited art galleries, played his violin, and he wrote his first scientific essay, a paper he titled On the Investigation of the State of Ether in a Magnetic Field. He was 15. No one read it, no one knew who he was, but the ideas were already forming. In 1895, he attempted to skip ahead and gain admission directly to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich, one of the finest technical universities in Europe. He failed the entrance exam. His French and botany scores were too low. The school's principal, recognizing something exceptional in the young man's physics and mathematics scores, suggested he spend a year at a Swiss secondary school in Aarau to prepare. Einstein took the advice, and that year in Aarau, living with a warm, open family, studying without the suffocating rigidity of German education, breathing the free alpine air, transformed him. The lonely, withdrawn boy began to open up. He became confident. He began for the first time to imagine himself as a man who could change science. He entered the Zurich Polytechnic in 1900, and there, among the lecture halls and laboratories of Zurich, he met Mileva Maric. She was the only woman in their physics cohort. She was Serbian, deeply serious, intellectually formidable. They fell in love over textbooks and midnight conversations about electrodynamics. Einstein's parents were against her relationship, opposed to her background, her nationality, her religion. But Albert was in love, and for the first time in his life, he had found someone who could follow him into the deepest recesses of his thinking. He graduated in 1900, and then the world ignored him again. He applied for academic positions. He was rejected again and again. His professors, who found him arrogant and insubordinate, gave him lukewarm recommendations. Unable to find a teaching post, he took a job as a technical assistant at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. He evaluated other people's inventions for a living. It was, by any conventional measure, a dead end. But Einstein was not done. Inside that modest office, working 6 days a week evaluating patent applications, Albert Einstein, in his spare time at the corners of his desk, in the hours before dawn, was quietly preparing to detonate the foundations of physics. In 1905, he published 4 scientific papers in a single year. Not 1, not 2, 4. Each one was a revolution. The first explained the photoelectric effect using quantum theory, work that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize. The second provided mathematical proof of the existence of atoms through the analysis of Brownian motion. The third introduced the special theory of relativity, upending centuries of Newtonian physics by demonstrating that the laws of nature are identical for all observers moving at constant speeds, and that the speed of light is absolute. The fourth paper, the most famous equation in human history, established the relationship between mass and energy, E equals mc squared. He was 25 years old. He was a patent clerk, and he had just changed humanity's understanding of the universe forever.
Fame did not come immediately. In the beginning, the world of physics hardly noticed, but slowly the scientific community began to catch up. Other physicists read the papers, they debated them, they tested them, and one by one they were forced to acknowledge what the unknown clerk in Bern had done. Albert Einstein had not merely proposed a new theory, he had dismantled the bedrock assumptions of classical physics and rebuilt them on entirely new ground. By 1919, he was the most famous scientist in the world. That year, during a solar eclipse, two British expeditions, one in West Africa, one in Brazil, confirmed his prediction that light bends around massive objects like the sun. Sir Arthur Eddington, the astronomer who led the expeditions, sent a telegram that effectively announced to the world that Newton had been superseded. The news spread within days across every major newspaper on Earth. Einstein's photograph appeared on front pages from London to Tokyo. He became, almost overnight, something that no scientist had ever been before, a global celebrity. But behind the photographs, behind the carefully cultivated image of the gentle, disheveled genius with the wild hair and the kind eyes, the private life of Albert Einstein was far more complicated and far more painful than the world was ever allowed to see. Mileva Maric, the woman who had loved him through his years of obscurity, the woman with whom he had shared the most intellectually electric period of his life, had paid a devastating price for that love. In 1902, before they were married, Mileva had given birth to their daughter, a girl they referred to in letters as Liesel. Einstein never traveled to Serbia to meet her. The child was illegitimate, and illegitimacy carried a social stigma in 1902 that could have destroyed Einstein's emerging academic career before it began. So Liesel was quietly left behind. In January 1903, when Mileva traveled to Bern to finally marry Albert, she came without her daughter. After that, Liesel Einstein simply vanished from all records. She is not mentioned in a single letter after 1903. There is no birth certificate, no death certificate, no medical record that historians have ever been able to find. Some researchers believe she died of scarlet fever in infancy. Others believe she was quietly given up to adoption to a family in Serbia. Her fate has never been conclusively determined, and the world did not even know she had existed until 1986, when a cache of love letters between Albert and Mileva was discovered in a drawer in California, and historians realized with shock that the greatest genius of the 20th century had a secret daughter who had been deliberately erased from history. The marriage between Albert and Mileva deteriorated steadily after the miracle year of 1905. Einstein's rising fame brought with it new opportunities, new cities, new circles of brilliant and powerful people. Mileva, who had once been his intellectual equal, found herself increasingly confined to domestic life, caring for their two sons, Hans Albert, born in 1904, and Eduard, born in 1910. She grew withdrawn. She suffered from depression. Einstein, for his part, grew distant and cold. His letters from this period suggest a man who had begun to view his wife more as a domestic inconvenience than as a partner. In 1914, when Einstein was appointed to a prestigious position at the University of Berlin, Mileva and the boys followed him to Germany, but the marriage was, by then, already broken beyond repair. Within months, Mileva took the children and returned to Zurich. Einstein did not stop her. Instead, he drew up a document, a coldly legalistic list of conditions under which he would consent to continue the marriage. Among those conditions, that Mileva would not expect any intimacy from him, that she would not reproach him, that she would serve him 3 meals a day and not disturb him in his study. It was not a marriage, it was a contract of total subjugation. Mileva refused. They separated, and in 1919 they formally divorced. As part of the divorce settlement, Einstein made her a remarkable promise, one that speaks volumes about his private awareness of what their partnership had truly been. He promised her the money from the Nobel Prize he had not yet won. In 1922, when the Nobel Committee finally awarded him the prize in physics for the photoelectric effect, every krona of the prize money went, as promised, to Mileva. She invested it in property in Zurich, where she lived out the rest of her life caring for their son Eduard, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia at the age of 20. She died in 1948, largely forgotten, her own extraordinary mind having been consumed entirely by the demands of being Albert Einstein's wife. Meanwhile, Einstein had already moved on. In 1919, the same year he divorced Mileva, he married his cousin, Elsa Lowenthal, a warm, practical woman who adored him and whose greatest gift to Einstein was that she asked nothing of him intellectually. Elsa managed the household, shielded him from interruptions, organized his social engagements, and allowed him to retreat entirely into his work. The marriage was comfortable, if not passionate. Einstein, by his own admission, was not a man built for deep personal loyalty. He had affairs throughout his marriage to Elsa, which she apparently chose to accept in silence. Back in Germany, a far darker storm was gathering. The rise of the Nazi Party in the early 1930s brought with it a virulent wave of anti-Semitism that targeted not only Jewish people in general, but Jewish science in particular. Einstein's theory of relativity was publicly denounced as Jewish physics, degenerate, dangerous, a corrupting foreign influence on the pure tradition of German science. Physicists who had spent their careers championing Einstein's work were pressured to distance themselves. Books were burned. Einstein's name appeared on Nazi lists of enemies of the German people. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Einstein was in California at the time. He never returned to Europe. In March of that year, he formally resigned from the Prussian Academy of Sciences and renounced his German citizenship. For the second time in his life, he made himself stateless, though this time the statelessness was chosen not out of adolescent rebellion, but out of moral conviction and a recognition that the country of his birth had become something monstrous. He accepted a permanent position at the newly founded Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He arrived in America with little more than his violin, his pipe, and the accumulated weight of a mind that had already seen more of the universe's secrets than any human being before him. Princeton suited him. He wandered the campus in old sweaters and sandals. He would stop students to ask them questions, discuss philosophy, argue about music. He was, by then, already an icon, the very embodiment of genius in the popular imagination, and he was lonely. Now, before we continue, we want to ask you something. You've just followed Einstein through his early years, his rise to fame, his private tragedies, a secret daughter, a broken marriage, exile from his homeland. What strikes you most about his story so far? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because the final chapter of Einstein's life is where everything, his science, his conscience, and his legacy converges in ways that no one could have predicted.
The summer of 1939 found Albert Einstein on Long Island, New York, sailing, walking on the beach, enjoying what passed for rest in the life of a man whose mind was never truly at ease. But the world around him was not at rest. Europe was sliding toward catastrophe, and a group of physicists had come to Einstein with information that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The scientists, among them Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner, both refugees from Nazi Europe, brought Einstein urgent news. German physicists had successfully split the uranium atom. Nuclear fission had been achieved, and the theoretical implications were catastrophic. A weapon of unimaginable destructive power was now, for the first time in human history, a genuine possibility. If Nazi Germany achieved it first, the consequences were too terrible to contemplate. Einstein, the committed pacifist, the man who had spent decades advocating for peace and international cooperation, agreed to sign a letter addressed to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The letter warned the president of the potential for an extraordinarily destructive bomb and urged the United States government to begin its own research into nuclear chain reactions immediately. It was signed on August 2, 1939. Germany invaded Poland 30 days later. That letter, later known as the Einstein-Szilard letter, set in motion the chain of events that would lead, eventually, to the Manhattan Project, the most ambitious scientific undertaking in human history. And on August 6, 1945, to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Japan. 3 days later, Nagasaki. More than 200,000 people killed, most of them civilians. Cities reduced to ash in moments. The age of nuclear weapons had begun. Einstein heard the news of Hiroshima by radio. He was at a cottage in the Adirondacks. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, oh my God. He had not worked on the bomb itself. His security clearance had actually been denied by US military officials, who considered him a potential security risk given his pacifist and socialist associations. But the connection was undeniable. His equation, E equals mc squared, had provided the theoretical framework that made the bomb possible. His letter had urged Roosevelt to pursue it. The weight of Hiroshima settled onto his shoulders and never left. In the months and years that followed, Einstein became one of the most passionate voices in the world for nuclear disarmament. He co-founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists. He wrote articles, gave speeches, met with world leaders. He argued with fierce urgency that humanity had gained access to a power it was not yet wise enough to control. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our way of thinking, he wrote, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. He never forgave himself for the role he had played in initiating what he saw as the greatest danger the human species had ever faced. His final years in Princeton were marked by increasing isolation. Elsa had died of heart disease in 1936, and Einstein lived simply: a few rooms, his books, his violin, his pipe, his blackboard covered with equations. He was offered the presidency of the newly founded State of Israel in 1952, following the death of Chaim Weizmann. He declined, citing his advanced age and his doubt that he had the natural aptitude for dealing with people and performing official functions. But privately, those who knew him believed his reasons went deeper. Einstein had devoted his life to science. He did not want his final chapter written in the language of politics. He continued working, still searching in his final years for a unified field theory that would reconcile gravity with electromagnetism, that would bring together everything he had spent his life exploring into a single unified framework. He never found it. It remains, to this day, unfinished business, the great problem that even the greatest mind of the 20th century could not solve. On April 13, 1955, Einstein was admitted to Princeton Hospital with severe abdominal pain. Doctors discovered an aortic aneurysm, a weakness in his main artery that had been diagnosed years earlier and managed conservatively, had begun to leak. Surgery was recommended. Einstein refused. "I want to go when I want to go. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He died in the early hours of April 18, 1955. He was 76 years old. His last words were spoken in German to a nurse who did not understand the language. They were never recorded. He had left precise instructions about what was to happen after his death: cremate the body, scatter the ashes in an undisclosed location, hold no memorial service, create no shrine, build no monument. He had spent his life resisting the cult of personality that had formed around him. He wanted no part of it in death. But death, as it turned out, was not the end of Albert Einstein's story. Because in the early morning of April 18, 1955, while Einstein's family prepared Einstein's body for cremation, a pathologist at Princeton Hospital named Dr. Thomas Stoltz Harvey conducted the routine autopsy, and then, Quietly, without authorization, without permission from Einstein's family or from Einstein himself, Dr. Harvey removed Albert Einstein's brain from his skull and kept it. He placed it in a container of formalin. He took photographs. He convinced himself that he was acting for science, that the brain of the greatest genius in human history was too valuable to simply be cremated and scattered. When Einstein's family discovered what had happened, they were furious. But Harvey, with remarkable persistence, managed to negotiate a reluctant retroactive acceptance from Einstein's eldest son, Hans Albert, on the condition that the brain would be used strictly for scientific research. And then began one of the strangest journeys in the history of science. Harvey lost his job at Princeton Hospital. He moved from city to city, Kansas, Missouri, back to New Jersey, carrying Einstein's brain in cardboard boxes in a Cider jar stored beneath a beer cooler in the trunk of his car. He gave away slices of the brain to researchers he called his interest. He drove across the country with a journalist named Michael Paterniti, Einstein's brain riding in the back seat of a Buick Skylark on a quixotic trip to deliver a piece of it to Einstein's granddaughter in California. She didn't want it. The scientific results, in the end, were inconclusive. Some studies found unusual proportions of certain types of cells in specific regions of the brain. Others found it unremarkable. Harvey never published the definitive paper he had promised for 40 years. He died in 2007 at 94 years old in the same hospital where he had performed the autopsy that changed his life. Einstein's brain, or what remains of it, is held today in a pathology lab in Princeton. The brain of the man who had asked as a child why a compass always pointed north. The brain that had imagined itself riding alongside a beam of light. The brain that had written E equals mc squared on a blackboard and quietly rearranged the architecture of reality. It sits today in a jar, in a lab, in the city where Albert Einstein last spent his years, still yielding its mysteries to anyone willing to look closely enough.
Albert Einstein died without having solved the problem that obsessed his final decades. He never achieved his unified field theory. He never reconciled quantum mechanics, the science of the very small, with general relativity, the science of the very large. That reconciliation remains today the holy grail of theoretical physics. Thousands of brilliant scientists have spent their careers pursuing it. None have succeeded. But what Einstein did achieve in the years between a compass in Munich and a final breath in Princeton was something that almost defies comprehension. He demonstrated that space and time are not fixed, absolute things, but are relative, flexible, shaped by mass and motion. He showed that energy and matter are two forms of the same thing. He gave us the theoretical tools that made possible everything from nuclear power to GPS technology to the study of black holes and gravitational waves. He showed us that the universe is stranger, more beautiful, and more deeply unified than any human being had dared to imagine before him. And he did all of this while being a man, a complicated, flawed, deeply human man who abandoned a daughter, failed a marriage, signed a letter that contributed to the birth of the atomic bomb, and spent the rest of his life wrestling with that fact. A man who played Mozart at midnight and walked to work in his pajamas. A man who said no to the presidency of a nation and yes to the deepest questions the cosmos had ever posed. Was Albert Einstein the greatest genius in history? That question has no final answer. History is full of extraordinary minds, but few of them changed everything. Few of them looked at the universe and, with nothing more than thought, rearranged what the rest of us believed was true. Albert Einstein did that, and the universe,
The vast, indifferent, silent universe he spent a lifetime listening to is still speaking in the language he taught us to hear. Thank you. Thank you for staying with this story from beginning to end. Through the silent streets of Ulm, through the patent office in Bern, through the sunlit campus of Princeton, to that strange and haunting final chapter with a jar and a brain and the mystery of what genius truly is. You have just witnessed one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived on this planet, and the best is still to come. On this channel, every story is told with the depth and detail it deserves, because history is not a list of facts, it is a river of human experience, and every current deserves to be followed to its end. If this documentary moved you, if it made you think or question or feel something, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. Leave a comment below and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of history. The past is always present. We'll see you in it.